Up next, mixed operating system environments with OpenZFS. It is a very cross-platform file system, perhaps maybe equaling or slightly beating on many fronts FAT32. So the good news is OpenZFS supports Illumos through cherry-picked features, FreeBSD, GNU Linux, macOS, Windows, NetBSD, and Solaris. Your mileage may vary on Solaris. But the bad news is it supports all of those, which makes a few challenges a thing we got to deal with all the time. And we could lead with story time, but let me just punch through some topics that have come up over the last few months. And in those challenges, above all, heaven forbid there be a pool creation time flag that you forgot that you might need, bless you, for your comfortable cross-platform support of your shares and pools for import. And which you need to disable. So Alan, be ready with your wisdom.
Which is, if you want a pool to be compatible with all of those operating systems.
Does he have a microphone up? Awesome. Yep. Let it rip.
If you have a pool you want to be compatible with all those operating systems, especially if Illumos doesn't have every single feature, then at creation time you might need to make sure not to use certain features. And so disabling just those feature flags when you create the pool. Luckily, newer OpenZFS has a thing where you say compatibility equals a macro so that it's easy to create a pool that's backwards compatible with whatever older version of ZFS or specific version of TrueNAS that you're trying to be compatible with.
Are there flags beyond feature flags like normalization and other things that you may need to
That's
set?
per data set.
Purely per data set.
I don't think there's any that are per data set that would be different across operating systems.
Got it. Thank you, Alan. And Patrick, I might be a bit hot. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's not exactly.
One sec.
Let's pot him up.
3, Borm? 4.
Thank you.
There's not exactly feature flags, but some dataset features may be different between OSs. Different ACL types. ZFS supports NFS v4, but potentially some may prefer POSIX. Those store it differently on different platforms. And obviously you set one, you import a different platform, you just lost all ACLs. There could be several properties which work slightly different. NFS export, SMB export, obviously.
The old vol mode.
Vol mode, yeah.
Those ones are data set.
The question was a pool level or data set level. Okay, so it sounds like we have the feature flags as a blanket accommodation, which is getting better than ever. And hopefully the FreeBSD installer, for example, will let you choose a pool level for feature flags. I've made a mock-up of it for the front end, but not yet the back end. I've got someone looking at that. Moving on, let's go through the points and we'll dive in with those real world, because between you and Mav and Alan, I know we've got some good answers there. We touched on the perennial challenge of sharing both NFS and SMB from the same data set, especially across different OSs. And mind you, a bunch of us are coming from the VeriSign perspective, where to preserve .com, they are dual stacked, Linux and FreeBSD, just institutionally, so that if there is a catastrophic issue on one or the other, they are hopefully covered and going to continue. So some organizations lean way into that, and they want to be feature parity compatible, etc. And then I don't know to what degree NFS v4, v3, or SMB protocol levels might play in, but let's get to that later. Excuse me. And start thinking about your real world challenges. And is that actually as far as I went? Boom. Yes. So that said, Alexander, can you talk about what Acrobatic's TrueNAS does to accommodate, be it the common NFS and SMB sharing? And I know you've got a Linux-based product and a FreeBSD-based product. Can you summarize just what, through your blood, sweat, and tears, you've come up with to address these issues?
I know we have some deployment of that kind, but I don't remember how big they are. Obviously, we need working ACLs compatible between them, and NFS used in both cases. They are more or less close. I think there may be some artifacts of some specific bits, but generally they should work But as far as I know, biggest issue is locking and caching existing because they use different models on SMB and NFS, and that's work of different team. I'm not qualified to answer it fully, but that's a difficult topic. It's possible, it's doable, but at least as far as I know, I wouldn't use it for simultaneous access to same files. Like either read-only for both or different files at different time or something like that. Otherwise, it may create some pain.
Alan, have you deployed any mixed environments like that where it was a hard requirement to either have a very portable pool between OSs or multiple protocols shared off the same data set, which might...
Not really, no.
Okay.
No. I know recently the article we published on our website showed how to use ZFS boot menu on Linux to run multiple distros off one pool, but that's, generally hopefully the same version of ZFS on all those distros, but it doesn't have to be, again, with that compatibility equals flag when you create the pool. Beyond that, I think currently in the wild, most people's use case would be a one-time migration, and so just reconfiguring your NFS properties isn't the end of the world versus, what we talked about, 2 years ago or something on the leadership meeting about can we standardize the settings in, share NFS equals in ZFS so that they do the right thing on the different platforms, or at least have, share NFS is just an alias to share NFS.FreeBSD and share NFS.Linux, where the pool could retain the right settings for both, but then how do you make sure the user updates both when they actually make a configuration change and you don't end up at, when they switch back to Linux, their NFS rules are 4 versions out of date, or 4 revisions behind what the rules on the other operating system they were running on. So that's a challenge. But luckily I've not had to deal with people trying to run NFS and SMB on the same files at the same time because, as Mav said, it's short of trying to get both of those to let ZFS handle the locking for them or something. There's not really a good way to do that.
Locking's one side, but NFS v4 and SMB both use user cache delegation, so that if one protocol delegated user to cache the data, other won't know it. So it's if file accessed by both, it's a request for corruption at the end. So it should not be simultaneously accessed by both. But you mentioned booting from different OSs. That's actually one trick we use it as I'm still using partially as a path for migration from TrueNAS core to scale. That it's possible to from the same pool actually boot both FreeBSD and Linux. And if I remember, biggest issue was there. While it's good for FreeBSD, that loader doesn't need any configuration. It just read everything. It can all data sets on a pool. It can boot anything. And pretty flexible. Linux require a grub update, and after migration forward, and if once you boot back to FreeBSD, you cannot modify your grub configuration. That's maybe a challenge. But otherwise, dual booting like that from different boot environments actually works. That's
and in general, I've seen the way Ubuntu deploys it. They have the boot pool have no feature flags enabled to try to avoid grub being incompatible with the next change they make in ZFS, and that's even been a problem in FreeBSD when we first import a new feature. I think when we added the VDEV Zap v2 concept, that the FreeBSD loader would be like, hey, I don't recognize that feature. How am I supposed to read this pool? And in general, maybe if a pool's only purpose is to boot from, keeping the feature flag list down to a minimum helps ensure compatibility and just that it doesn't change. But without the newer thing that the compatibility flag added, where it makes zpool status not constantly nag you to update the pool, it was less.
For that thing, actually, compatibility option is definitely a good thing. One pain we hit, at some point we tried to update a config file for grub. And formally grub should have supported extensive data set, except we hit some bug in grub code that made it I don't crash, or one way or another it doesn't boot at the end. So formally it should be read-only compatible and should not care, but grub doesn't support it. And we hit some grief trying to recover the situation. It's because once people already upgraded the pools, they cannot go back.
Yep.
And if we remove the options from the grub config, the pool will complain that pool has incompatible option.
Yep.
So I'm not sure how we should resolve situation like that in the future. Can we somehow prepare some mechanism to fix errors like that when we have to revoke some feature, but not call it a problem? But otherwise, solution would be, if you need dual booting, you should just compatibility set something like FreeBSD, grub, and then it should work. No, FreeBSD general loader at this point just able to boot anything. I think we don't even have config for it.
Right, there's no config. It just, if you have, if you're trying to run 2.3 on FreeBSD 12, you would need, your loader would be like, I don't know what fast dedupe is. And it would complain.
Most of the features are read-only compatible, so it doesn't need to know what it is.
In the past, it was bad about just being like, that feature's not in my list, so no, even when it was, it didn't consider read-only compatibility, or the fact that the feature's there, but it's marked disabled because it's never been used, or it's enabled but not active, like fast dedupe.
Well, I don't remember when it got support, but definitely right now we have enough functionality to handle disabled and unknown features which are read-only compatible.
I think Tumas did that, and we thank him very much for it.
Quick question there. Are there feature flags that are implicit in a send such that you couldn't do some acrobatics with a send to remove feature flags, if that makes sense?
No.
Insofar as you want to get back to, oops, I enabled a feature flag, I will do whatever it takes to get back to where I was. Can you do some acrobatics in sending to another pool and back to strip certain feature flags?
Yeah, so that was a point I made earlier. Right now, if you do ZFS send with no flags, it goes back to being compatible with V28, like, 15-year-old ZFS.
That's the question.
Which is helpful at times, but maybe not sane for a default today. Like, being compatible with ZFS 10 years ago is fine, but maybe we can, at this point, assume that everybody's compatible with LZ4.
I'd like to mention, most of LZ4 could be overridden just by not transferring compressed blocks.
Right.
But just
shouldn't compressed blocks be the default today?
Would be nice to, I agree. That's we should extend compatibility options to cover or create separate ones.
Yes, and so the default is the oldest LTS we support of ZFS, not V28 from 20 years ago.
Yeah, but I'd like to mention one more feature was introduced recently in 2.3, long file names. And if you enable those and create actually long file names, question what would happen if you you probably won't be able to receive that to previous ZFS.
Yes, and we actually had a stealth one happen there we added the ability to have a large microzap. So by default, when you create a directory, if you have under 2,000 files in it and none of your file names are more than 48 bytes long, it'll store it as one big 128K block instead of a pointer map or pointer tree. And that works well. And so we added the ability to have a microzap that was bigger, up to the 16 megabytes. Didn't consider what would happen if you sent that to a pool that didn't, but by default, when you send, it doesn't send large blocks. If you have any records that are over 128K, it chops them up into 128K chunks, but you can't do that to a microzap. And so you end up with only the first 2,000 files in the directory showing up on the destination. Yeah, so we had to make a feature flag and make ZFS send activate that feature if you use it that way.
So just from the user perspective here, could you add basically the same compatibility mechanism to ZFS send where you say, send me a stream that is compatible with this OS or whatever?
Yeah, that would be the idea. Would you do ZFS send-o compat equals FreeBSD 13.2 or TrueNAS 2304 or whatever, or ZFS 2.2, and it would enable all the features that are supported there and not anything else. And maybe we set the default to whatever the oldest supported version of ZFS is, instead of the current, which is default to being as backwards compatible as possible. And then all these different flags you have to enable to get bigger things. Because I think a lot of people would be surprised to find out that, I was using 1 meg blocks, but when I ZFS send it to my backup, it's not using 1 meg blocks. And if I've already bootstrapped my thing, I can't switch to using large blocks after.
I guess it would be definitely good to have that thing. Just comes to mind that all the features has to be enabled. Like if you have on receiving side large block disabled and you try to receive that stream, even so it's formally supported, it's not enabled, it will fail. So user should be prepared to make sure that pool is upgraded to that level, or we should somehow.
Right. Well, they're setting compat equals to that, so hopefully their pool compat on the receive side is set to the same level.
Does that fail gracefully, or does it say like, hey, there is no large block support when you tried to send?
So before it would send and you'd end up with a directory you couldn't read all the files out of. Now, when you try to send it, it says your pool has this feature enabled because you've created, as soon as you create a microzap that's bigger than 128K, it enables the feature, or it activates the feature. When you try to do a send without capital L, if that flag is on, it tells you, no, something in your pool wouldn't be compatible with this. You have to use capital L to replicate.
Since you're talking about compatibility aliases, I would think would be also useful to have a compatibility alias for just continue to be whatever I am. Because you said the default.
Like an alias for whatever version I'm running right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't make me think, just follow me.
Yeah. That can make sense.
Other stories, who's had sends and feature flags just bite them in the
Microphone.
behind? Yes. And there's a mic in back if you like.
He has to turn it on now.
Now, on the compatibility thing, there's no easy way to learn what compatibility pool is created with. And that's something that might be nice in some.
Yeah, that should just be a pool property. It isn't. It isn't now, but yeah, we should save that as a pool property when you set compat equals. Yeah, so that later you can read back what compatibility level is this pool. We'd have to make it, when you zpool upgrade,
exactly.
it needs to update that property.
does.
Right now, you basically have to use a useful property list. You go back through it and try and figure out which compatibility that is so that you can create a new pool.
That matches, yeah.
I think we do have compatibility property because if you try to enable some option not enabled in that compatibility list, it will upgrade. It will start to will complain. We have some features
Okay.
that are not expected in that level.
It is there.
Okay.
Yeah, remember the issue we had with the ZFS send, we actually used.
That's the one I was just describing.
Oh, okay, fine.
That's why only the first 2,000 files in the directory would show up.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yeah, we created a flag, and that's fixed in 2.3.
It seems like possibly like adding that to the ZFS pool. It seems like possibly just adding that compatibility option as a flag to zpool status would probably be an easy way, because everybody uses that command all the time, and you just add a -c or whatever, and then you can see that. Just fine.
When did compatibility aliases arrive? Is it something you can assume like LZ4 that everybody has, or there's still a lot of pools out there without some notion?
I think it's 2.2, so I think
Okay,
like
that's-
Ubuntu 2004 does not have that.
Got it.
And certainly older FreeBSD does not have that either, although are we still supporting?
Yep. So I
12
don't think
doesn't have that.
I think 12 wouldn't have it at all. 13 is 2.1, so I don't think has it either. So I think it'd be only 14 when you get 2.2 when you'd have that feature.
But
It's
do
a
we care
journey.
like, if the features are supported themselves?
Yeah, like the features are, but like the actual zpool create-o compat equals, was that in 2.1 or only 2.2?
Probably to
Okay, 13 has it, so it is in 2.1.
And one angle on all of this is simply migration. Oh, we're tired of this OS and we're moving to this other one. Stu, in your environment, I assume you're one OS and you always have been. Do you ever need to go compatible?
Not as of yet, but with Ubuntu's lunacy and snaps, we're going to be migrating off of it.
So his response was, with Ubuntu's lunacy with snaps is motivating abandoning that platform. And that's probably as no fault of yours as a user. Thank you, vendors. From the back row, any experiences, questions, observations? Have we seen in practice people using the compatibility aliases, or is it just sort of an inside baseball kind of thing, or inside
I've seen
football?
a little bit.
whatever
I
play?
think your suggestion, like that installer should use it more, probably makes a lot of sense. Like, you know, when FreeBSD 14.3 comes out, it probably should still default to making pools that other versions of FreeBSD can use, or at least giving you the option to decide, you know, do I have anything older, or everything's going to be newer from now on?
Correct. And the one challenge there is that once you have the full list of options, it's like pages of levels. And it's like, well, yeah, no, I don't want to be back in how many years back, 20 years ago. So
Right.
it's a fine line.
You know, the same things came up with just, you know, we were talking about maybe a VDEV property to manage certain settings. At what point does the number of properties get too big that, you know, it's multiple screenfuls and it's like,
It already is.
yeah, exactly. And so do we try to break those into groups and have like properties that are invisible by default, but with an extra flag will show up so that, you know, when you do ZFS get on a data set, it's mostly the relevant ones.
I said,
Templating it.
Yeah, or just, you know, ones that are more kind of implementation detail stuff don't show up unless you ask for them, kind of thing.
I think
But at some point, you're still going to want it, just like you have the kernel module
Yep.
fix. I need to tune it this way. I still need to be able to tune it. So
Yeah, and so the properties still be there. It's just when you do a get,
doesn't
should it give you everything by default or not?
there is already source for each option, whether it was received, whether it was set, or it's default
Inherited.
one.
Yeah.
If we could just simply filter it, show me everything locally set, it would be dramatically easier to read. It would be just, instead
Yeah,
of 100, it will be like 5.
Even just like
properties.
filter out all the ones where the value is the default.
That's a good point.
we opt for that now.
That's too easy.
I know a lot of times rather than using Git to see those type of properties, a lot of times I'll specify them as column options on a list.
Yeah. Yeah, doing ZFS list -o, a bunch of properties and being able to get it kind of in tabular format. And you can do it as rows instead of columns if you do get, comma, separated list of things on a data set as well. But, you know, they can get unwieldy like when there are all these properties. Like for VDEV properties, almost all the ones that exist right now are read-only like metrics. And as we've started to add more, it's like, well, at what point does it make sense to have them? And also, like, when we looked at failfast, it was, this one's, you know, it's not an enum where there's just a certain list. It's like it's almost a bit field. There are these 3 different times that you might want to fail fast. And like, do we try to have a comma separated value supported list where you can kind of list these things? Or do we have a separate property for each one that's on and off? Or what makes sense when you have, you know, this kind of multimodal setting? And obviously exploding the number of properties seems like the bad way to do that. When there's only 3, maybe it's okay, but if there's 8 options that each individually can be on and off, do we try to make a compound property or what? I think Pavel had the same questions doing the per data set rate limiting. Do we try to like limit writes by the bytes and IOPS and whatever all in one property, or do we end up with like 16 properties to do read, write, and total for IOPS, megabytes per second, and all the different metrics at once?
I think we are not a leader at this point. I think I saw some zpool get from QNAP or something. They has custom ZFS and saying they put everything into properties. The list was just endless.
Yeah, and with user properties, I've seen other people that have, you know, the whole VM config is a property in the storage of the VM and things like that. And
It's your performance.
yeah, you can get really long lists of these properties and you know, just storing extra things in them, and it works. But maybe we need at some point maybe ZFS get all defaults to filtering some of them out. But then how do you
Get some.
get some instead of all? Yes, or get non-default or something might be some useful helper aliases there, and that sounds like a great project for the hackathon on Tuesday.
Are there a top 3 data set properties that have bitten people, such as normalization or case sensitivity, or something that routinely just gets people? Are we reaching for the mic? Yes, let her rip.
I've been bitten by case sensitivity for SMB shares.
Okay.
Like you decided to enable it and then regretted it, or?
No, I decided not to enable it and then regretted it.
Interesting. Okay.
Probably.
I made it case sensitive, but since it was Windows, it didn't want to be.
So, you know, I mean, it's not a very important issue, but the fact that you can't set UTF-8 only except at creation time means that I have a bunch of data sets that really should have that set on them that don't, because I forgot 12 years ago, and now because we've, you know, migrated these data sets to new servers over time, it's like it's still set wrong. Mostly our users don't notice, but it's one of those things that bugs me because I would like to make sure that they don't unintentionally create new files that don't have names in UTF-8.
So would a send fix that, or
yeah, I
not?
was just wondering, is that one where if you snapshot it and send it and override on the receive side to force it to UTF-8, that it would fix it, or would it make a mess?
You can't turn UTF-8 only on except at creation time.
Right, so if you're doing if you're doing a replication and you're recreating it, at that time you could, and then you would copy all the existing data? Of course, you probably don't have room to duplicate all your data.
Yes. So I mean, you know, the issue. I don't know. I don't think I've ever been in a situation. Maybe we could. I'm not sure if I trust.
Well, I don't know that
send
send will do the right thing to munge existing names into UTF-8.
Yeah. I mean, probably it would not, and you'd end up with a bunch of names that were either just invalid or.
You don't receive into a data set.
Yeah, when you receive a full replication stream, it makes a new data set. So it's creation time, so you can set encryption and case sensitivity in UTF-8. But I don't know that send and receive are going to do the right thing, specifically the UTF-8 option, because it makes a big difference.
Yeah. My suspicion would be that it would fail if you actually had a bad file name, which is one of the reasons why we don't try to fix it after our grad students have been creating files with abandon. So, although I mean, usually they think the file system is just a database anyway. So.
And to be clear, it has to be at creation time of the file system is why I got bit by the case sensitivity one as well. And I have never been brave enough to try the send solution because I just expect that it would slam those two together and not do it right.
It wouldn't be a difficult test, would it?
If it was sensitive and you wanted to make it insensitive, that probably could work. But the other way around, the first time you have two files that equate to the same name, ZFS probably isn't going to notice, but you are when you go into that directory. I don't know what the ZAP cursor code would do when you had two file names that were the same but insensitively.
Maybe this is a test that should be added?
Probably.
Don't individual files have like an individual UUID?
So the way a directory works in ZFS is it's a key value store of the file name to the inode number or the object number. And so you would have two different entries that point to two different numbers. But when ZFS is looking through the ZAP, looking for the file name you asked for, if it's searching case sensitively, it'll be okay. But when you do case insensitive search, you might find the other file that is spelled with capital letters instead of small letters and read not the file you were trying to read. Or, if you RM it and ZFS removes one of them, does it stop or does it keep searching? And does it end up removing both or one or none?
I would guess listing ZAP should be working, but finding specific by name may not.
Yeah, if you try to look up a file in a directory by name, like when you try to cat the file, it might do the wrong thing.
There's something you can do like a reverse dedupe. It's like, hey, I'm looking for dupes, the file names are the same.
You could script that, look for the ambiguous possible files, and put a little prefix or suffix and just let her rip.
Samba's worked fine with case sensitive for me. it implements the insensitivity on its side instead.
There you go.
But
So-
it probably has a performance impact.
So I've never been tempted to do case insensitive because, well, we don't have any Windows users. At least not that we allow to use NFS. So I'm curious, how is case insensitive actually implemented? Does it actually use the full Unicode case fold algorithm, or is there some simpler hack?
I think in the ZAP layer, it's just an extra flag, and when it does the comparisons, it's not. I don't know if it's folding or what it's doing.
It translates from how store it into internal representation for comparison, but I don't know the algorithm how it does it.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it's very well used.
We have some Delphix folks, and I heard a comment like, we don't worry about disks anymore. Are database folks generally completely insulated and isolated from all these issues? It's not that
No,
big a problem?
it's not that. It's more like we run on VM, so run on ESX and on the clouds.
Okay, so on VMs and on the cloud, and so
Yes.
you're generally I'm guessing in a foreign file system on ZFS, be it ext something, or?
No, it's more like the disks that are provisioned to the VM already
Okay.
have some sort of RAID.
Beep. Beep, beep.
Yes, like we're running on EBS, for example, right? That, like AWS already has that.
Battery trouble.
Get under the table.
Cool. And are there other circumstances where databases or otherwise it's just not a problem and you don't have to worry about these things?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe talk about the fact that they're backed by SANS.
Exactly. That's what
Sandbagged?
I would say. Right. I don't think it's a database that doesn't need that. It's more like the storage that is presented to the VM already has kind of the redundancy protection.
Cool.
So that means that most of your deployments are not using like RAID Z at all. You just have one VDEV.
Correct.
Do you ever see checksum errors from the SANS?
I don't remember that being a big problem for us. I don't think that comes very often.
And we had one case with, I forget which customer it was, where they had, I think it was a pure storage backed thing for their VMs, and they started getting checksum errors, and they had deployed their TrueNAS with just one big VDEV that was from the VM. But yeah, eventually they did figure out that it was a firmware bug in the flash storage that was meaning that every once in a while they wouldn't get the right data back. Ooh. And so we rebuilt
Disks
the
lie.
VM.
Even if they're virtual, disks lie.
Yes, or especially if they're virtual.
By definition, they're lying. We have about 10 minutes for story time. Did I see a hand in back?
Just a recent
Yes, sir.
curiosity.
Number one?
So we're running on AWS EBS, and so we're doing the thing where there's just one VDEV, and we just create the pool directly on top of the EBS. And one of our operators was resizing the EBS sort of dynamically, and I guess we thought that was okay for years. But it started causing some issues. I'm curious if anybody else ran into that.
I don't have firsthand experience, but I've heard tell that when you resize, kind of underneath on the EBS side, it's basically deploying a new bigger volume and copying your data over to it, effectively like you were ZFS sending it from the old one to a new bigger one. And that I'm sure weird things could be happening in the middle of that process until the resize is finished, but I don't know much more about it. The other thing I've heard recently is that, EBS volumes are actually have kind of like sub-partitions in them, and that each chunk has its own, applies the IOPS limits itself, and like a limited queue depth. And so if you're doing all the IO to one subset of the EBS volume, you might see less performance than if your IO was spread across more pieces of the EBS. Was there a specific problem you were seeing, or?
I have to go back and look.
Okay.
How large is it? It was probably under 20 terabytes, maybe.
It was that small. That shouldn't be a problem.
There's another thing we've noticed where same operator was detaching from one instance and attaching that block store to a different instance and thinking that everything would be okay. What we noticed in practice on AWS is that it's almost like that system isn't near until you sort of exercise the disk for a day. And so like the next day, the whole thing appears to be close to the instance, whereas up until that point, it's like you could request something and it's like, well, let me go fetch it for you. So curious what might be going on there.
Yeah, especially like if you're not careful to launch the instance you're going to attach to in the same availability zone as the source one, then it probably is under the hood, relocating that data from one building to another building that's closer to where your new VM is. I know Delphix also implemented the zpool initialize feature.
Was it
because
either
they found,
0 or something?
Yeah, they found that EBS volumes, when the first time you wrote to each sector is when they provisioned that. And so the first write to any sector took longer than before. And so when they first create the instance, they would go and basically in the background write out a pattern of something other than 0 because it would get compressed away to every sector, so that when you go to use it for real, the latency is going to be the normal latency and not the special, this is the first time latency.
Yeah, you get the volume, but you get it on paper. And then eventually...
It's basically like if you're using VMware, it's thin provisioned.
Yes.
And so they're not actually allocating the storage and deciding where to put it until you use it. And so use the whole thing up front, and then when you go to use it later, it'll be a consistent latency instead of, the same, oh, this is a new one, and it's going to take 4 times as long or something. But yeah, virtualization is just layers of lies.
Pool compatibility. Recently had an exercise trying to recover system from a backup, which was ZFS on FreeBSD, I think 11.3 or something like that. I take 3 or 4 attempts to recover, but neither of those booted. Even after I set pool to everything disabled, I've completed generic pool v28 or whatever, it still was not booting on created on newer FreeBSD, but wasn't booting on 11.3. And only when I booted 11.3 and created a pool, after that everything worked. I still don't know what was the magic and why old loader and newer ZFS weren't compatible, but it weren't in features. But I still have no idea why would that happen. Obviously,
Yeah, I don't
loader
know.
is not very verbal to say.
No, the loader is not. Using the user boot or like the Beehive load, which is the loader compiled to user space, you might be able to trace it or add more printfs and not have to keep rebooting to try it.
Yeah, maybe.
Because I've used that as a recovery tool once before, where the pool was damaged enough there was no way ZFS was going to work with it, but the loader is just dumb enough that it will just try the reads anyway, enough to get back, the SSH keys and a couple of other files from etc that I wanted back to rebuild the same machine.
Well, anything else? Any final thoughts? Or shall we jump into about a 12-minute break? Thank you, everyone.